A typical morning in Chicago transforms when Evelyn, an elderly and seemingly fragile lady, tries to enter her trusted bank, only to be stopped by the security guard who judges her by her appearance. Humiliated and embarrassed, she decides to take action, revealing a shocking truth. Evelyn is not just any customer. She is the founder and owner of the bank. Get ready for a story of justice, dignity, and lessons that no one will forget. Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago began with the usual buzz of the streets. Cars rushed by, and groups of people walked with firm steps towards their destinations. In this bustling scene, Mrs. Evelyn Johnson stood out as a figure of calm and fragility. At 78 years old, her steps were slow, but each movement seemed to be made with a quiet determination. Evelyn was a black woman with curly, graying hair tied up in a messy bun. Her face, marked by time and the hardships faced throughout her life, displayed deep wrinkles that told stories of resilience. She wore simple clothes, a worn cotton blouse and a dark skirt that reached her ankles. On her feet, she had low, worn shoes that seemed almost as old as she was. She carried a modest bag made of aged leather, which she held firmly at her side. She walked towards the Central Bank of Chicago, located at one of the busy corners of Wacker Street. The distance of a few blocks felt long for her tired feet, but Evelyn did not allow herself to give up. The bank was one of the few places where she still conducted her personal transactions, and today she needed to make a deposit and withdraw some cash. With each step, she focused on the simple yet necessary task. As she approached the entrance of the bank, Evelyn noticed the large glass sign reflecting the cloudy sky above. The automatic door seemed like a challenge, but she pressed on, determined. However, before she could reach for the handle, the security guard, Jake Thompson, a tall and sturdy man, quickly approached her. He had seen many people coming in and out of the bank throughout the day, but something about the elderly woman caught his attention. Without thinking twice, he intercepted Evelyn before she could cross the automatic door. With a serious expression and an imposing posture, Jake blocked the entrance. "What are you doing here, ma'am?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of suspicion. Evelyn, surprised by the abrupt approach, hesitated for a moment. "I'm sorry, young man. I just came to make a deposit and withdraw some money," she replied in a soft voice, although her frailty was evident. Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly doubting her words. "Are you sure you have enough money to transact here?" he arrogantly interrogated, looking at her with disdain. "People like you don't usually come to a bank like this." Embarrassment washed over Evelyn. She felt the gaze of other customers on her, some curious and others ashamed of the situation. "I'm sorry, but I have been a customer of this bank for many years. I just want to make my transactions," she said, trying to remain calm, even as humiliation grew in her chest. Jake, ignoring her apology and insisting on his discriminatory stance, continued, "Look, ma'am, this place is not for people like you. If you're not sure what you're doing, maybe you should look for a smaller bank." The words came out of his mouth with a cruelty disguised as protection of the establishment. Evelyn felt small, her heart tightening against her chest. She knew the humiliation was unfair, but the weight of age and frailty made her vulnerable. "Please, I just want to go in," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Evelyn tried to compose herself, but Jake's words echoed in her mind like a devastating blow. She had always been treated with respect by her employees and clients, and that public humiliation, coming from someone who was supposed to protect the environment, deeply wounded her dignity. The weight of her physical and emotional fragility became almost unbearable, and she felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. The other clients around her began to whisper among themselves. Some cast sympathetic glances, recognizing the elderly woman's embarrassment, while others, more conservative, remained silent, lacking the courage to intervene. The atmosphere in the bank had become heavy, almost oppressive, but no one knew how to act in the face of that situation. Jake, still with his superior posture, insisted, "Look, ma'am, maybe it's best if you leave. If you need help, I can call management, but you can't stay here if you're not sure what you're doing." His tone was authoritative, and he seemed to believe he was in control of the situation. Embarrassed and with a flushed face, Evelyn felt she no longer had the strength to fight. With trembling hands, she slowly moved away, heading for the bank's exit. The gazes of the other clients followed her, some with guilt, others with shame for what they were witnessing. She knew she was about to be expelled from a place that had, in fact, been a fundamental part of her life, but she no longer wanted to cause a scene. Upon reaching the door, before leaving, Evelyn paused. With a discreet gesture, she took her cell phone out of her bag and made a silent call, keeping her back to Jake and the other clients. Her voice was so low that no one could hear what she was saying, but the air around her was charged with tension. As soon as the call was made, Evelyn, with tears in her eyes, left the bank, leaving behind the cold and impersonal environment that had been part of her routine for so many years. Silence settled again, but now with a new weight, the doubt about who that lady really was. Inside the bank, Jake crossed his arms, feeling victorious for having removed someone he considered a threat. However, the atmosphere around him was different. The clients were visibly disturbed by his attitude, and some began to murmur, questioning whether he really should have treated a lady that way. A few minutes after Evelyn's departure, the atmosphere at the Chicago Central Bank was still charged with the tension caused by the humiliation of the elderly woman. The employees were trying to continue with their routines, but the mood was heavy, and whispers circulated among the customers about what had happened. It was then that the bank door opened again, this time with the entrance of an elegant man who immediately caught everyone's attention. David Carter, a middle-aged lawyer, walked in with determination. His dark suit and perfectly adjusted tie conveyed a natural authority. Upon entering the bank, he looked around, quickly realizing that something was wrong. The serious expression on Evelyn's face while on the phone and her hasty exit raised his concern, and he knew he needed to act. Quickly approaching the service desk, David asked firmly, "Where is Mrs. Evelyn Johnson? I need to speak with her immediately." The employees, confused and still processing what they had witnessed, exchanged nervous glances. Sarah Mitchell, the manager, tried to respond calmly. "She just left, sir." But there was a situation with the security guard, Jake Thompson. He prevented her from entering and, well, we don't know the exact reason. David frowned, discomfort growing as he sensed the tension in the air. "Did anyone see what happened to my client at the bank entrance?" he questioned, his voice now more authoritative. The room fell silent, and the other customers, who had heard part of the conversation, began to pay attention, curious and apprehensive. Mr. Collins, who had witnessed the incident and was nearby the counter, decided to intervene. "I saw everything. The lady was treated humiliatingly by the security guard. He blocked her at the entrance, doubted that she had money, and ridiculed her in front of all of us," he said indignantly. His voice carried the weight of a man who could no longer ignore what he considered an injustice. David immediately turned to Jake, who was still in the corner, trying to maintain his authoritative posture. "You here now?" David ordered, his voice sharp. Jake, caught off guard, approached reluctantly, aware that he had lost control of the situation. "You humiliated this lady at the bank door, and she is my client. You will deeply regret having acted this way," David said, with a piercing look that made Jake feel small. David, with a worried expression, looked around until he found Evelyn sitting in a discreet corner, her phone still in her hands but visibly shaken. He walked over to her, crouching down to keep a softer tone. "Mrs. Johnson, please come with me. We need to talk," he said, trying to offer some comfort. Evelyn lifted her gaze, and David could see the suffering in her eyes. She slowly stood up, and the two moved away a bit from the bustle of the bank. "What happened?" David asked, his voice low and firm. She took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions that overwhelmed her. He stopped me at the entrance, said I didn't belong in a place like this," Evelyn began, her voice trembling. "Jake, he thought I was here to cause trouble. He doubted me, David. In front of everyone, he said that people like me shouldn't be in a bank like this." Tears began to slide down Evelyn's face, and she hesitated, unable to continue. David, realizing how much this affected her, held her hand firmly. "I'm so sorry you went through this," he said sincerely. "No one should be treated this way, especially you." Evelyn nodded, but the embarrassment was still evident on her face. I felt so humiliated," she whispered, looking at the ground. "I thought maybe I wasn't welcome here anymore." At that moment, David noticed that the other customers were paying attention to the conversation, and he knew he needed to act quickly. "Mrs. Johnson," he began in a more serious tone, "are you ready to reveal something important? Something that everyone here needs to know?" Evelyn hesitated, but realizing that David was determined, she responded in a calm voice, Yes, I am ready. She took a deep breath, gathering all her courage, and looked around, facing the curious customers and employees. My name is Evelyn Johnson, she started, her voice still trembling but gaining strength. I am one of the largest shareholders of this bank. In fact, I am the founder and owner of the Central Bank of Chicago. The murmurs that followed were immediate. Customers who had previously looked at her with disdain now expressed surprise and shock. Jake, who had stepped away, stopped in his tracks, frozen as he realized what those words meant. Evelyn continued, her gaze now firm. My bank account is far greater than many customers present here. I built this bank with great effort, and I did it to provide security and dignity to everyone, regardless of who they were. She paused, and her expression hardened. And I never imagined I would be treated with such disrespect within my own institution. The silence in the bank was profound. Some customers began to whisper among themselves, processing the revelation. Others, like Mr. Collins, looked at Evelyn with admiration and guilt. David, standing beside her, felt satisfied to see that the truth was finally being told. Jake, who was close enough to hear Evelyn's revelation and the conversation between her and David, was paralyzed. The reality of what he had just discovered hit him like an electric shock. He could barely process the fact that the elderly woman he had so publicly humiliated was, in fact, the owner of the Central Bank of Chicago. His face paled, and he felt the effects of his arrogance beginning to crumble around him. I didn't know, Jake stammered, trying to justify his behavior, but his words sounded empty and unconvincing. I acted out of caution. It's my job to maintain the security of the bank. His voice faltered, and he knew he had no way to defend himself. David Carter, with a serious expression and contained indignation, looked directly into Jake's eyes. Your attitude was unacceptable, he said firmly. You not only doubted a customer's ability, but you publicly humiliated her for no reason. Legal action will be taken against you for discrimination and harassment. David's words echoed throughout the room, and the silence was broken by murmurs among the customers. Some began to express support for Evelyn, while others showed disappointment in Jake's conduct. Mr. Collins, the man who had tried to intervene earlier, joined the chorus of voices. You should be ashamed, young man. Respect should be the bare minimum expected from everyone here, he said, his voice firm and authoritative. Jake, now surrounded by critical gazes, felt increasingly cornered. He tried to maintain his composure, but the emotions of shame and anger were bubbling to the surface. The embarrassment on his face betrayed the impact of his own ignorance. Evelyn, who had been trying to control her emotions until then, now felt the weight of the situation beginning to dissipate. She looked at David with gratitude, acknowledging the support he was offering her. I just wanted to be treated with dignity, like any other customer, she said, her voice still trembling but now more resolute. And I didn't expect to be treated like this in my own bank. The other customers, upon hearing the woman speak, began to show more empathy. Some people approached her to apologize, recognizing the mistake they had witnessed. A few minutes after the tension at the bank intensified, the manager, Mark Stevens, arrived on the scene, quickly informed about what had happened with Evelyn and Jake. He was a man in his 50s, with an authoritative posture and an air of seriousness that demanded respect. Upon entering the environment, he immediately sensed the heavy atmosphere and the disappointed looks from the customers. David Carter was the first to approach Mark. Jake Thompson treated Mrs. Johnson in an unacceptable manner. He publicly humiliated her by blocking her at the entrance and doubting her ability to conduct transactions. Now we know she is the owner of the bank, David explained frankly. His voice carried the urgency of correcting a major mistake. Mark frowned, clearly outraged by what he had just heard. This is absolutely unacceptable, he said, with a firmness that echoed throughout the room. He immediately turned to Jake, who was leaning against a wall, visibly embarrassed and nervous. Jake, you are fired. Your conduct does not reflect the values of this institution and will not be tolerated. The word fired hit Jake like a bomb. He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Nervousness took over his body, and he knew he had no way to defend himself. With his head down, he began to back away, feeling the weight of humiliation descend upon him. Mark continued, now turning to Evelyn. Mrs. Johnson, On behalf of the Central Bank of Chicago, I sincerely apologize for what you went through. No one should be treated this way, especially you, who is such a fundamental part of this institution," he said with genuine reverence. Evelyn, who had listened to everything in silence, responded with dignity. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Stevens, but what happened today was far beyond a simple mistake. I want to ensure that this does not happen again and that actions are taken." Her voice was calm, but there was undeniable firmness. Mark nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course, we will do whatever is necessary. You will be treated with the respect you deserve, and I will ensure that this type of incident never happens again," he promised. Evelyn paused, looking directly at the manager. "Furthermore, I want to proceed with the process against Jake. What he did cannot go unpunished." Evelyn's determination was admirable, and Mark, although reluctant, knew she had every right to act. "I understand, and we support your decision. We will have an immediate investigation into the incident," he replied with a respectful expression. The other customers, who had witnessed the entire scene, began to murmur again, some expressing support for Mrs. Johnson, while others were still in shock at the revelation of who she really was. Mr. Collins, who had approached to listen, praised, "You are right. This needs to be resolved." Mark, realizing that the atmosphere needed immediate recovery, offered Evelyn something to compensate for what had happened. "Mrs. Johnson, please allow me to offer you VIP treatment at our agency. You will have priority access to all services, and your experience here will always be as pleasant as possible." Evelyn accepted the apology and the offer with gratitude, although she knew that the most important thing was to ensure that her dignity and that of other customers were preserved. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Stevens, but what matters most to me is that this institution is a safe and respectful place for everyone, regardless of who they are," she said. With that, the atmosphere in the bank began to stabilize, and the employees, relieved to see the situation under control, prepared to move forward. Jake, now distanced and in shock, began to realize the irreversible consequences of his actions, while Evelyn, with dignity and strength, prepared to ensure that justice was served. In the days that followed the incident at the Central Bank of Chicago, Evelyn Johnson's decision to sue Jake Thompson for racial slander quickly spread throughout the community. News began circulating in local newspapers and social media, attracting the attention of both the media and the public. Many showed support for Mrs. Johnson, while others expressed outrage at the treatment she had received within her own institution. Jake, for his part, faced the consequences of his prejudiced act. He was fired from the bank, a swift and necessary decision that Mark Stevens had already made as soon as he learned of the depth of the case. Now, Jake found himself isolated, with a tarnished reputation and the prospect of a lawsuit looming over him. The man who once felt superior due to his security position was now at the mercy of public judgment, and the community's disdainful glances began to turn against him. Meanwhile, Evelyn came to be seen as a figure of strength and dignity. She was not only the bank's owner, but a woman who, even at 78 years old, did not hesitate to fight against injustice. Her story inspired many, and she received support from various community groups, who congratulated her for her courage and determination. Cards of support, flowers, and even visits from local residents began to accumulate at her home. Amid all the attention, Evelyn remained calm and centered. She knew that her fight was bigger than a simple act of personal revenge. It was a battle against racism and social injustices that still permeated society. She granted a few interviews, in which she spoke about her experience and the importance of combating prejudice in all its forms. "It's not just about what happened to me," Evelyn said in one of the interviews. "It's about ensuring that no one else suffers what I suffered, especially in a place that should be safe for everyone. Respect must be guaranteed to every person, regardless of color, age, or social status." These words resonated strongly in the hearts of the community, and many began to reflect on the injustices that still existed around them. Evelyn's case was not unique, but she was determined to make it a landmark for change. Her legal action against Jake was a step toward justice, and she was willing to see it through to the end. Finally, when the trial against Jake Thompson began, the courtroom was full. Evelyn, accompanied by her lawyer David Carter, watched calmly as Jake, now visibly dejected, tried to defend himself against the charges. The evidence against him was clear, and Evelyn's testimony was powerful. Her presence in the courtroom, firm and dignified, conveyed a message that justice would be served. In the end, Jake was convicted and forced to face the consequences of his actions. The court's decision was met with applause from the community, and Evelyn felt a deep relief knowing that her fight for justice had been rewarded. Upon returning to the bank, Evelyn was warmly welcomed by the staff and customers. Mark Stevens, with a sincere smile, said, "Thanks to you, Mrs. Johnson, we are all learning a valuable lesson. Your courage has inspired us to be better." Evelyn smiled, but humbly responded, "The real work begins now. We need to ensure that respect and dignity are part of everyone's life, every day." The reflection on racism and social injustices continued to echo in the community, but there was a new hope in the air. Evelyn Johnson's story proved that justice can be served, and that, regardless of the adversities, dignity and respect are rights that everyone must fight to uphold.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to continue watching.